In the winter of 1939, as Europe plunged into chaos, a man in a white lab coat was thinking about war in a way no one else was. His name was Dr. Ancel Keys, a biologist, physiologist, and the son of a Colorado photographer. He wasn't a general or a politician. He didn't command armies or factories. But in a quiet laboratory at the University of Minnesota, he was asking a question that would one day save more American lives than any weapon of the war. What does it take to keep a soldier alive? Keys was not a soldier himself, but he had spent years studying the human body under stress, how it reacted to hunger, fatigue, and cold. He had climbed the Andes to test oxygen levels, dived into lakes to measure endurance, and starved himself to study metabolism. When war clouds gathered, the U.S. Army came to him with a challenge. America's military was expanding faster than at any time in its history, and its Quartermaster Corps, the branch responsible for feeding millions of men, was overwhelmed. The Army's existing field rations were bulky and heavy, relics of another era. The B ration was meant for cooking in base camps, big tins of beans, meat, and flour that required kitchens and stoves. The C ration, newly developed, was more portable, but still weighed nearly 5 pounds per day. For soldiers fighting on foot, in jungles or mountains, or parachuting behind enemy lines, none of this was practical. What the Army needed was something revolutionary, a complete meal for a single soldier that could fit into a pocket, survive any climate, and provide enough nutrition for a full day of combat. Keys accepted the challenge with the kind of curiosity only scientists possess, the curiosity of someone who wants to test the limits of what is possible. He began small, not in a factory, but at his own kitchen table. He laid out what he called the survival foods: hard biscuits, dried sausage, raisins, chocolate, and vitamin tablets. No luxuries, no spices, just fuel. He then sealed them in a small cardboard box, roughly the size of a paperback book. It weighed less than a pound. To prove it could work, Keys turned himself into the first test subject. For days he ate nothing but his own experimental rations: dry crackers, a bit of canned meat, some hard candy, and black coffee. He measured every heartbeat, every calorie burned. At the end of 2 weeks, he was thinner, tired, but still strong. It was enough. He wrote a report to the Army. A soldier cannot fight without food. The simpler the ration, the more certain the victory. The Army's response was cautious. In the world of bureaucracy and logistics, innovation is rarely welcomed. Quartermaster officers dismissed the idea as impractical, too small, too limited, too new. One colonel sneered, "You can't win a war on candy bars." But there were others, men who saw what Keys saw: a coming conflict where mobility would matter more than mass, and survival would depend on what a soldier could carry on his back. In 1941, the U.S. Army gave Keys permission to produce 5,000 test kits for paratroopers and airborne units. The experiment would determine whether his compact ration could keep a man alive in the field for 72 hours. He called it the Type K ration. The letter K, he insisted, stood for nothing in particular. It wasn't for Keys. It was simply a code designation between J and L. But to the men who would one day eat it, the letter would come to mean keep going. The K ration was designed into 3 small boxes: breakfast unit, biscuits, canned ham and eggs, soluble coffee, sugar tablets, and a piece of chewing gum. Dinner unit, cheese spread or pork luncheon meat, biscuits, powdered drink mix, and a bar of chocolate. Supper unit, canned meat, crackers, candy, matches, cigarettes, and a packet of toilet paper. Each complete day's supply fit neatly into a carton sealed with wax paper. It was simple, unglamorous, and light, just over 2 pounds for all 3 meals. To Keys, it wasn't about flavor, it was about survival. He designed it for men who might be trapped behind enemy lines, stranded at sea, or lost in the jungle. A soldier could keep moving without waiting for supply trucks or field kitchens. The ration was the embodiment of independence, a soldier's life in a box. When the army tested it at Fort Snelling and Fort Benning, soldiers laughed at first. Some called it the cracker pack, others Keys's cardboard diet. They missed real food. But after 3 days of marches and maneuvers, something unexpected happened. They weren't hungry. The ration worked. The results astonished even the skeptics. A single box, produced for just 25 cents, could feed a man for a full day, and it fit inside his jacket pocket. It didn't spoil in the rain. It didn't freeze in the cold. And it could be eaten while crawling through mud or hiding in a foxhole. For Keys, it was vindication. For the army, it was revelation. As 1941 drew to a close, the world was changing faster than anyone could imagine. In December, Pearl Harbor was attacked. America was at war. The country that had once debated whether it even needed such a ration now faced the reality of global logistics. Millions of soldiers scattered across every climate on Earth. Suddenly, Ancel Keys' little box was no longer an experiment, it was a necessity. Factories across the United States began producing the new ration in bulk. Women in assembly lines filled boxes with biscuits, tins, and candy bars. Stamped on each were the words, "Ration Type K, for use in jungle, Arctic, or desert operations." The rations were packed into crates and shipped by the thousands to North Africa, the South Pacific, the icy Aleutians. Somewhere in Minnesota, Keys watched the newsreels of America mobilizing for war, and he knew that his work, the quiet labor of a scientist, was about to march across continents. He would later write in his notes, "The strength of an army is not in its weapons. It's in the men who can keep fighting tomorrow." In a war that would be defined by machines, tanks, planes, ships, the most important weapon of all might just be a small tin-covered box no bigger than a soldier's hand. The K-Ration was ready, and soon it would feed an army. By the spring of 1942, the United States was at war on two fronts, across the burning sands of North Africa and in the endless Pacific. Factories thundered day and night. Steel became ships, aluminum became wings, and rubber became tires. But beneath the roar of the war machine, there was another, quieter production line. One made not of metal, but of cardboard, sugar, and tin. It was the production line for K-rations. What had begun as a scientist's experiment in Minnesota was now a national mobilization. The Quartermaster Corps, which once doubted the ration, suddenly needed millions. A single division of soldiers required over 10,000 K-rations per day, 3 meals per man. Across the country, from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin, hundreds of small food companies were drafted into service. They canned meat, baked biscuits, sealed chocolate, and packed matches into tiny boxes stamped Ration Type K. The rations rolled off the assembly lines like ammunition, and in a sense, they were. Each box was a soldier's weapon against hunger. At first, production was chaotic. Each factory had its own interpretation of Keys' design. Some used too much wax in the wrappers. Others sealed the tins so tightly soldiers needed a knife to open them. Complaints flooded in. Coffee packets that leaked, chewing gum that turned brittle, biscuits that shattered into dust. But war has a way of refining even the simplest inventions. Within months, engineers redesigned the packaging. Triple-sealed cardboard, tinfoil lining, waterproof wrappers. Soldiers could drop a K-ration in the mud or carry it through a tropical storm, and it would still be edible days later. By mid-1942, the first large shipments of K-rations reached the troops. Their destination, North Africa.
It was there, amid the blinding sand and 120-degree heat, that the little box faced its first true test. When General Eisenhower's forces landed in Operation Torch, they brought tanks, trucks, fuel, and guns. But inside every duffel bag, tucked beside letters from home, were K-Rations. 3 small boxes per day per man. The North African desert was no place for kitchens or hot meals. The sand infiltrated everything: rifles, engines, water barrels. Cooking was impossible. For many soldiers, the first thing they ate in combat wasn't a hot meal from a mess tent, it was a K-ration. They opened the breakfast unit first. Inside, a small tin of chopped ham and eggs, 4 square biscuits, powdered coffee, sugar tablets, and a piece of chewing gum. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warm if you mixed it with canteen water, and it filled the stomach. Soldiers laughed and called it Keys' Miracle Lunch. By evening, when the air turned cold and the wind howled across the dunes, they opened the supper unit. Cheese spread, crackers, and a chocolate bar wrapped in wax paper. Some lit cigarettes from the tiny matchbooks inside and leaned against their trucks, watching the desert stars. It wasn't a feast, but it was enough. The K-ration had passed its first test. Reports flowed back to Washington. Rations satisfactory under all conditions. Compact, lightweight, suitable for airborne and mobile troops. The success was undeniable. Production was expanded again, 2 million boxes per week. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Conveyor belts clattered as women in kerchiefs and overalls worked in endless rows, sealing tins and stacking boxes into wooden crates. They didn't know where the boxes would go, only that somewhere, halfway across the world, a soldier would open one and live another day because of it. By late 1942, the K-ration had earned a new nickname in the Army: the box that fed an army. It had proven itself not just as a survival tool, but as a symbol of ingenuity, a triumph of science and logistics over chaos. At the Quartermaster Command in Philadelphia, engineers displayed a single K-ration under glass beside rifles and helmets. The sign beneath it read, "Firepower sustains the moment. Food sustains the man." For Dr. Ancel Keys, the news was bittersweet. He was still in Minnesota, far from the front lines, but his invention had become part of every soldier's life. Letters began arriving from officers and medics, thanking him for the little box that never quits. He replied to one, "It's not the box that matters, it's the men who carry it. I just gave them something they could trust." By 1943, the K-ration had become as common as the M1 rifle and the steel helmet. From the mountains of Italy to the jungles of New Guinea, soldiers carried it everywhere, the silent companion in every battle. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't delicious, and it wasn't enough for comfort, but in a world at war, survival was the only luxury that mattered. The K-ration had done what no general could do. It fed the fight.
By 1943, the K-ration was no longer a prototype or an experiment. It was as much a part of an American soldier's identity as his rifle, helmet, and dog tags. It had crossed oceans, marched through deserts, and flown into battle. Yet it was in the crucible of Europe, under real fire, in real mud, that the little box would prove what it was truly worth. The North African campaign was over. The Allies had landed in Sicily, and the next step was Italy, a narrow, mountainous battlefield that chewed up supply lines and spat out men. Roads vanished under mudslides, bridges were bombed daily, and meals, hot meals, were a fantasy. For weeks at a time, the only thing soldiers could count on was what they carried. In the packs of the 36th Infantry Division, the 45th, and the 82nd Airborne, the K-ration was always there, small, sealed, and silent. It wasn't glamorous food, but it did its job. It didn't spoil, it didn't rot, it didn't need cooking. And in a war where so much depended on weather, chance, and chaos, that reliability was priceless.
A soldier in the mountains near Monte Cassino wrote in his diary, "I eat the same thing every day. Breakfast box, dinner box, supper box. They taste like cardboard and dust, but when you've been in the rain for 4 days and it's all you've got, that first cracker crunches like heaven." By mid-1943, the K-Ration had spread across every theater. Marines aided on the beaches of Tarawa, airborne troops carried it into Sicily and Salerno, tank crews wedged it between ammo boxes, pilots stuffed them in survival kits. It was also beginning to evolve. The Quartermaster Corps added new flavors: corned beef loaf, canned chicken, even soluble lemonade powder. Each box now included water purification tablets and a single 4-cigarette pack, a small mercy in a world of tension. But the true test, the moment that would define the K-Ration's legend, came on the morning of June 6, 1944. D-Day, Normandy. At dawn, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers faced the largest amphibious invasion in history. The men who stormed Omaha, Utah, Juneau, and Gold Beaches carried rifles, grenades, and, tucked inside their pockets, the same thing: 3 K-Rations wrapped in wax paper. The night before, aboard troop ships in the English Channel, soldiers opened the breakfast unit: canned meat and biscuits. Some ate in silence, others offered a half-joking toast with the powdered lemonade. One paratrooper from the 101st Airborne wrote in a letter he never sent, "If I don't make it back, tell Mom the ham and eggs weren't bad." When the landing craft ramp dropped and the sea exploded around them, no one was thinking about food. But hours later, amid the wreckage and exhaustion, the survivors reached into their packs and found the little box still dry. Some sat behind tanks, others in shell holes, tearing the cardboard with trembling fingers. It wasn't much: a few crackers, a can of meat, a piece of chocolate. But in that moment, it was everything. War photographers caught the image again and again: mud-covered soldiers crouched behind sandbags, chewing slowly, faces hollow but eyes alive. Those pictures would appear in newspapers back home: GIs taking lunch in France. But to the men in the field, it wasn't lunch. It was life. In the weeks after D-Day, as the Allies fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, the K-Ration became both a blessing and a curse. It was light and portable, yes, but it was never meant to be eaten for months on end. Soldiers complained of monotony, of shrinking energy, of what they called the K-Ration stomach. Still, it kept them going when nothing else could. One medic from the 2nd Infantry Division remembered being trapped behind enemy lines for 3 days with 3 wounded men. He wrote, "We had 1 K-Ration between us. I opened it and split everything: 1 cracker, 1 bit of chocolate, 1 sip of coffee. It was the best meal of my life." That story spread through the ranks. In a war measured in tonnage and tanks, here was a single box of food keeping men alive. Across the Atlantic, in Anzio, Italy, the K-Ration played another kind of role: psychological. Soldiers under constant shell fire said that the ritual of opening the box, unwrapping the contents, and drinking the instant coffee gave them a sense of normalcy. It was routine in chaos. Even the sound of the tin lid popping open became a kind of comfort. You heard it, and you knew someone nearby was still alive. Meanwhile, back in America, posters appeared in factories and cafeterias. The K-Ration feeds freedom. Pack carefully. Somewhere, it feeds a man in battle. Women working the assembly lines in Chicago and Philadelphia began slipping small notes into the boxes. "From home, with love. Eat this and come back safe. We're proud of you." Months later, soldiers would open those boxes on muddy fields in France and smile faintly when they found the notes, the handwriting smudged but legible. For many, it was the only voice from home they'd hear for weeks. By the end of 1944, the K-Ration had become inseparable from the image of the American GI. In Life magazine photographs, they were everywhere, stacked in foxholes, scattered across the decks of transport ships,
tucked into belts and jacket pockets. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fancy, but it symbolized something fundamental, the quiet genius of simplicity. A major in the 1st Infantry Division summed it up in his field report. The K-Ration does not inspire men to fight, but it allows them to continue fighting when everything else fails. And so while tanks rumbled and planes roared, it was this small, unremarkable box, designed by a scientist with a dream of efficiency, that followed soldiers from North Africa to Normandy, from the mud of France to the snows of the Ardennes. The K-Ration had entered the fire of war and emerged as one of its quietest heroes.
By the final year of the war, the K-Ration was everywhere. It crossed continents and oceans, stacked in endless pyramids of brown cardboard and olive-drab tins, riding in trucks, trains, and ships that stretched from the ports of England to the coral atolls of the Pacific. Wherever there were American boots in the mud, there was a K-Ration within reach. In France, the summer of 1944 brought liberation and hunger. After D-Day, Allied columns pushed through hedgerows and cratered villages, chasing a retreating enemy, but outrunning their own supply lines. The weather turned, bridges collapsed, and for days, entire battalions ate nothing but what they carried. Those were the days when the K-Ration showed its quiet power. Soldiers tore open their little boxes under shattered church towers, in the shade of burned-out tanks, even inside foxholes carved from Norman clay. Private Richard Lane of the 90th Infantry recalled, "It was the same thing, day after day, and we'd gripe about it. But when you're soaked to the bone and the trucks haven't made it through for 2 days, you open that box, smell the coffee, and suddenly the world doesn't seem so bad. It tasted like survival." Thousands of miles away, the same box was feeding a different kind of war. In the Pacific, Marines were island hopping through jungles that seemed to breathe and bleed. The humidity turned uniforms to rags, food to rot, and soldiers to ghosts. But the K-Ration, triple-wrapped, wax-sealed, born in a lab to endure any climate, survived. On Bougainville, it kept soaked riflemen alive for weeks when fresh supplies couldn't land. On Saipan, it sustained wounded men trapped behind Japanese lines. And on Iwo Jima, it became part of the daily rhythm of war. Wake, dig, fight, eat, fight again. By then, more than 100 million K-Rations had been produced. Every morning, on every front, American troops opened the same box. Breakfast, biscuits, canned eggs, coffee. Dinner, cheese spread, sugar tablets, candy. Supper, meatloaf, crackers, chocolate, and cigarettes. It was monotonous, but dependable. A soldier once joked, "The enemy has bullets, we have constipation." But even that dark humor masked a truth. The K-Ration kept them moving. In the Ardennes, during the freezing hell of the Battle of the Bulge, thousands of GIs survived on nothing else. Cut off by snow and enemy armor, they melted ice in helmets, heated tins over candles, and sipped the bitter comfort of instant coffee. For some, that was the only warmth they had. A paratrooper from the 101st Airborne later said, "When we were surrounded at Bastogne, all we had were rifles, frozen boots, and K-Rations. That box was the only thing between us and dying hungry." When supply planes finally broke through the clouds, men cheered as crates tumbled from parachutes. It wasn't ammunition or medicine that drew their eyes. It was food. Inside each wooden box were smaller boxes, each marked with a bold black K. In the middle of one of the coldest battles of the war, those tiny rations felt like home. But the same ration that saved lives also revealed the limits of endurance. It was never meant to feed soldiers for weeks or months, yet in places like the Philippines or New Guinea, there was no alternative. Malnutrition set in. Men lost weight, energy, and appetite. Vitamin deficiencies led to what medics called the K-Ration blues: fatigue, irritability, and hollow eyes. Still, the troops pressed on. The K-Ration wasn't perfect, but it was there. And in war, presence often mattered more than perfection. By 1945, the little box had circled the world. On Okinawa, Marines crouched in shell holes, trading candy bars for cigarettes. On Iwo Jima, medics stuffed K-rations into their packs beside morphine and bandages. On Corregidor, paratroopers opened them on top the very island where the U.S. had once surrendered 3 years before. Everywhere, the ritual was the same: a quiet pause amid chaos. Tear the wax paper, peel open the lid, inhale the smell of meat, sugar, and cardboard. Eat fast, move again. In those moments, the K-ration became more than food. It became a promise that someone, somewhere, had thought about them, that no matter how far from home they were, home hadn't forgotten. One photograph from Iwo Jima captures the moment perfectly. A Marine, his uniform scorched and torn, sits in the black volcanic sand. Around him, the world is smoke and ruin. In his hands, a small open box. He's not posing, not smiling, just eating, slowly, as though reclaiming a piece of humanity in the middle of madness. The caption reads, "Lunch break, 3rd Marine Division, Iwo Jima, 1945. It wasn't lunch. It was life itself, contained in a piece of cardboard the size of a book. Back in the States, Ancel Keys followed the war's progress through telegrams and letters. He read about men saved in the jungle by his rations and others who cursed their blandness in the mud of Europe. He took both as compliments. In one of his wartime notes, he wrote, "A ration is not meant to be loved. It is meant to endure, just as those who eat it must." And endure it did. From the deserts of Africa to the beaches of Normandy, from the snow of Bastogne to the ash of Iwo Jima, the K-ration had proven something profound: that survival in the end doesn't always come from the biggest weapon or the fastest tank. Sometimes it comes from something small enough to fit in your hand. As 1945 drew to a close, the war was ending, but the image of the little box lingered. It had fed armies, sustained invasions, and given countless men the strength to see another dawn. When the guns finally fell silent, the K-ration was there too, stacked in depots, loaded onto trucks, sent to refugees and prisoners of war, turning from tool of battle to instrument of mercy. It had done its job, and now it would pass quietly into history, its work complete, its legend just beginning.
The guns fell silent in August 1945. Across Europe and the Pacific, soldiers who had marched, fought, and starved for years finally stood still. The tanks cooled, the planes quieted, and the ships came home. Yet amid the wreckage and the ruins, one of the most enduring symbols of the American war effort wasn't made of steel or gunpowder. It was made of cardboard. The K-ration, small and simple, had done its job. It had followed soldiers across 5 continents and 2 oceans, through jungles, deserts, mountains, and beaches. It had fed men in foxholes, bombers, trenches, and hospitals. It had kept them alive long enough to see peace again. And now, as the world rebuilt itself, it became something else: a relic, a lesson, and a legacy. In September 1945, ships unloaded mountains of leftover supplies from the Pacific and Europe. Among the piles of unused ammunition and medical kits were millions of unopened K-rations. Rather than waste them, the U.S. Army began distributing them to war-torn communities in France, in Italy, and even in parts of Japan. Children who had never seen chocolate before bit into the sweet bars once made for soldiers. For many, the first taste of post-war relief came not from a loaf of bread, but from a small American ration marked with a bold black K. In that moment, the little box became a quiet ambassador, a symbol of survival shared between former enemies. Back in the United States, Dr. Ancel Keys returned to his laboratory at the University of Minnesota. He was older now, his hair thinner, his voice softer, but his mind was still restless. He had spent the war studying starvation, nutrition, and human endurance. He had watched his creation save lives, and in some cases, push the limits of human health. Keys understood something few did at the time: that food was as much a weapon as any rifle,
as vital to victory as any factory. He would spend the next decades proving it. In 1947, he launched the Minnesota starvation experiment, studying how nutrition could rebuild the bodies of those who had endured famine. Later, he authored the 7-Country Study, which explored the links between diet and heart disease and introduced the world to what he called the Mediterranean diet. But for all his fame as one of the fathers of modern nutrition, Keys always carried a quiet pride for his wartime invention. When asked in an interview years later what he thought of the K-Ration, he smiled and said simply, "It worked. It did what it had to do." The military, meanwhile, learned its own lessons. The K-Ration had shown the power of science, packaging, and logistics, but also its limits. Soldiers couldn't live indefinitely on concentrated calories alone. They needed variety, vitamins, and morale. Out of that realization came a new generation of rations, the C-Ration, redesigned for long campaigns, and eventually, in the 1980s, the MRE, meal ready to eat. But every MRE, every survival kit, every compact food pack that came after carried a trace of Keys's vision. Food that fit in your hand, nutrition that could survive the impossible, energy when everything else failed. The Army's modern ration laboratories still cite the K-Ration as the foundation of portable field nutrition. The same principles that fed soldiers in Normandy now sustain astronauts aboard the International Space Station. Controlled calories, balanced nutrients, efficient packaging. A design born in the desperation of 1941 ended up shaping how humanity eats in space. And what of the box itself? A few survived. In museums across the United States, the Smithsonian, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, the Quartermaster Museum in Fort Gregg Adams, Virginia, they sit behind glass. Faded olive drab. Edges frayed. The lettering barely visible. Ration, Type K, breakfast unit. Contains biscuits, canned ham and eggs, soluble coffee, sugar tablets, and chewing gum. Visitors stop and stare. To modernize, it looks unimpressive, small, utilitarian, even dull. But to those who know its story, it is something more profound. Within that fragile cardboard lies the heartbeat of an army, the proof that victory can come from discipline as much as destruction. For the men who ate them, the memory never faded. Veterans would talk about them decades later, sometimes with affection, sometimes with disgust, always with respect. One Marine who had fought at Tarawa recalled, "We hated them. We loved them. They kept us alive. That's all that matters." Another, a paratrooper from the 82nd Airborne, wrote in his memoir, "When I think of the war, I remember the sound of rifles, the smell of diesel, and the taste of those damn K-Rations." Open the box, and there was home. Dry, safe, simple. For these men, the box was more than food. It was a connection. To family, to the idea of normalcy, to life itself. As time passed, the K-Ration faded from use, replaced by new technology, new wars, new challenges. But its legacy persisted, not just in the field rations that came after, but in the idea it represented. That ingenuity and compassion can be as powerful as weaponry. In the end, the story of the K-Ration isn't just about calories of cans. It's about the science of survival, how a man with a mind for biology changed the way nations thought about war. It's about the understanding that strength doesn't come only from armor or artillery, but from endurance, from what keeps the soldier standing when everything else has been taken away. Today, when you walk through the World War II galleries at the Smithsonian, you'll pass the great machines of victory: the P-51 Mustang, the Sherman tank, the Enigma machine. But tucked quietly in a display case near the end of the hall is a small, square box, no larger than a folded hand. A soft light falls on it. The label reads, K-Ration, the soldier's meal, 1941 to 1945. Developed by Dr. Ancel Keys. used by U.S. forces worldwide. Light, simple, reliable. It kept them alive. The display is small, but if you stand long enough, you can almost hear it. The rustle of wrappers in the wind, the hum of distant engines, the low murmur of soldiers talking through the night, clutching that same box under their coats. The war ended generations ago, but the little box that saved more American lives than any tank still speaks, not with noise or fire, but with the quiet voice of survival. It tells us that in every great war, amid every great invention, there are small miracles, human, humble, and enduring, that change the world far beyond the battlefield. And the K-Ration was one of them.